The late summer heat baked the dusty ground of the county auction yard, pressing down with a weight that felt ancient and indifferent. It settled in the lungs, a fine grit that coated the back of the throat and turned every sound dull and distant. The air smelled of hot metal, sweat, and the nervous musk of animals who knew their fate was being decided by the rhythmic, unintelligible drone of the auctioneer. Elias Thorne stood near the back, by a splintered post that had held the same fence line for 50 years. He did not belong here. Not anymore. The sun beat on the weathered leather of his hat, carving deep lines into a face already mapped by grief. His presence was a silent anomaly, a ghost returned to a place he had sworn off a decade prior. The other ranchers, men he had known his whole life, gave him a wide berth, their glances a mixture of pity and old, uncomfortable respect. They knew his story. They knew the silence that had swallowed his ranch, the quiet that had become his only companion. He kept his eyes down, fixed on the churned earth, trying to ignore the frantic patter of the auctioneer's voice. It was a language of commerce, of appraisal and dismissal, and it grated on the stillness he had so carefully cultivated. He had not come for any particular reason he could name. An impulse, sharp and unwelcome, had pulled him from his solitude, a nagging current that felt like a premonition. Then, the noise of the crowd shifted. The low murmur of bids and side conversations fell away, replaced by a tense, uncertain silence. A new lot was being led into the ring. It was a stallion, black as a starless midnight, with a coat that drank the harsh sunlight and gave nothing back. But it was not the horse's beauty that stilled the crowd. It was the raw, contained violence in its posture. Its eyes were wide, white-rimmed with terror and fury. Scars, old and new, mapped its powerful flanks like angry rivers. A tremor ran through its massive shoulders, a promise of chaos barely held in check. Leading the beast was a boy. He could not have been more than 10 or 12, small and thin, lost in clothes that were too big for him. His hair was a tangle of dusty brown, and his face was a pale, blank mask. He held the lead rope with a fragile grip, yet the stallion, for all its wildness, seemed tethered to him by an invisible thread. The boy's silence was different from Elias's. Elias's was a fortress built brick by brick. The boy's was a vacuum, an absence where sound and expression should have been. The auctioneer, a fleshy man named Harris, cleared his throat, regaining his rhythm. Lot 73, folks. A stallion of questionable temperament, part of the Vance estate seizure. Untrained, unbroken. Sold as is. What am I bid for this fine specimen? Let's start the bidding at 500 inch. A dry, humorless chuckle rippled through the assembled ranchers. 500 for a horse that looked more likely to kill a man than carry one. It was a joke. A polished voice cut through the quiet. $100. Arthur Vance stood near the front, immaculate in a clean shirt that seemed to repel the dust. His wealth was a palpable force, an armor against the grime and struggle of the world around him. He looked at the horse not with a horseman's eye, but with the cold appraisal of a man buying a problematic asset to be liquidated. Harris, eager to please the wealthiest man in the county, grinned. $100 from Mr. Vance. A bargain. Do I hear 150? Silence. No one was foolish enough to challenge Vance, especially not for this animal. Vance smiled, a thin, predatory expression. He would break the horse or have it put down. It did not matter which. It was about possession. Then, a voice, rough from disuse, cracked the hot air. $101. Every head turned. The words had come from Elias Thorne. He had not lifted his head, his gaze still fixed on the ground, but his voice, though quiet, carried the weight of a stone dropped into a still well. Harris the auctioneer scoffed, an incredulous, wheezing sound. $1? Elias, this isn't a charity case. A murmur went through the crowd. Thorne bidding? And with such a paltry sum? It was an insult, an act of public madness. Vance's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, fixing on the man in the weathered hat. This was not about the horse anymore. It was about the challenge, the public defiance from a man who was supposed to be a relic, a ghost. 200, Vance snapped. 201, Elias said, his voice a little stronger now. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met the boy's for a fleeting second. In that blank gaze, he saw a flicker of something he recognized. A deep, abyssal loneliness. The bizarre duel continued, Vance's bids escalating in angry, round numbers, Elias's following with his single, stubborn dollar. The spectacle was no longer about the horse, but about the two men, the rich industrialist and the broken rancher. The crowd was rapt, caught in a drama they did not understand. Finally, Vance, his face flushed with fury, threw up his hands. Fine. Let the old fool have his broken horse for a pittance. He can have the boy's troubles, too. Harris, flustered, banged his gavel. Sold. To Elias Thorne for $501. As the sound of the gavel echoed, a final, strange act unfolded. The stallion, which had been stamping and pulling against the rope, suddenly went still. It turned its massive head, its wild eyes softening as they found the small, silent boy. With a grace that seemed impossible for such a creature, it lowered its head, dipping its muzzle almost to the dust in a gesture that was unmistakable. It bowed. The boy reached out a small, trembling hand and laid it on the stallion's forehead. A shudder went through the animal, a release of tension, of fear. The invisible thread between them was now visible to all. The crowd stared, speechless. The scoffing had died on their lips. Elias Thorne walked forward, his worn boots kicking up small puffs of dust, and took the lead rope from the boy's hand. He did not look at Vance. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at the boy and the horse, a silent trinity bound by a mystery that now belonged to him. The journey back to the Thorne Ranch was conducted in a profound silence, broken only by the crunch of tires on the gravel road and the soft snorting of the stallion in the trailer. The boy sat in the passenger seat of the old truck, as still and quiet as a stone, his hands folded in his lap. He had not spoken a word. He had not even looked at Elias. His gaze was fixed on the side mirror, watching the reflection of the horse trailer as if to assure himself it was still there. Elias's ranch was a testament to a life paused. Dust lay thick on every surface inside the small house, a fine gray shroud over a life that had ended 10 years ago. Fences sagged in the pastures. The barn door hung crooked on a single hinge. This was not a place of healing. It was a tomb, and he was its willing caretaker. He led the horse, which he now thought of as Shadow, into the most secure corral, its sides built of thick, solid timber. The boy followed a few steps behind, a small, silent satellite. Once the gate was latched, the boy simply stood by the fence, watching the horse. Shadow, in turn, ignored the water trough and the hay Elias had thrown, and stood near the fence line, its head low, close to the boy's small form. There they remained, two solitary figures communicating in a language of pure stillness. Sheriff Brody had arranged the temporary custody of the boy, whose name, according to the auction paperwork, was Leo. Social services is a mess, Brody had said, his voice low and concerned. They were just going to put him in a group home hours away. Vance was his legal guardian, claimed the boy was a distant ward, said he was mute since he found him. Better he stays with you for a day or two, Elias, until we figure this out. You know animals. Maybe you can understand this. Elias knew Brody saw something more, something that went beyond a simple stray. Brody remembered the man Elias used to be. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip and cast long, mournful shadows across the yard, Elias decided to brush the stallion down. The horse was wary of him, its muscles tensing as he approached, but it did not lash out. Its attention remained fixed on the boy, who watched from his post at the fence. As Elias worked the curry comb through the thick, matted coat, his fingers snagged on something tangled deep within the horse's mane, near the crest of its neck. He worked it free. It was a small piece of braided leather, weathered and scuffed, darkened by years of sweat and dirt. It was shaped into a crude, stylized bird. A swallow. Elias's breath caught in his chest. His heart, a dull, sleeping thing for a decade, gave a painful, violent lurch. He stared at the object in his calloused palm. The world seemed to tilt, the scent of dust and horseflesh replaced by the memory of pine needles and his wife's laughter. Elena had made these. Dozens of them. Little leather charms she would stitch while humming softly to herself. She had tied one, exactly like this, to their son's saddle, to Samuel's first saddle. The memory, buried under a mountain of grief, erupted with brutal clarity. Samuel, so small and proud on his pony. The sudden, dark sky. The roar of water. The day the creek had become a monster and stolen everything from him. They had found his wife's body. They had never found Samuel's, nor that of the pony he was riding. The flood had taken them, the official report said. Lost. Gone. He closed his hand around the charm, the worn leather pressing into his skin. He looked from the charm to the boy, who was now staring at him, his pale face unreadable but his eyes wide, fixed on Elias's clenched fist. The stallion nickered softly, a low, questioning sound. The past was not just a memory. He was holding a piece of it in his hand. Maria, the town veterinarian, arrived as dusk settled. She was a woman who understood loss. Her own quiet sorrow etched around her eyes. She and Sheriff Brody had come together, their concern a silent, shared weight. Brody had been a deputy back then, one of the first on the scene of the accident. The horse is sound, physically, Maria said, her voice gentle as she finished her examination of Shadow. Malnourished, scarred, but strong. It's the trauma that's the problem. Same as the boy, she looked over at Elias, who stood apart, the leather charm still clutched in his hand. Elias? What is that? He opened his palm without a word. Maria gasped softly. She recognized it instantly. Elena's. Brody stepped closer, his face grim. I remember that pony Samuel was on, he said, his voice low and heavy with the past. A tough little thing. Black, like this one, only smaller. Never found it. We all just assumed, he trailed off, the assumption hanging in the air, that a pony and a small boy had been swept away to nothing. Vance took guardianship of the boy about 9 years ago, Brody continued, his mind working, piecing things together. He kept him on that isolated estate of his. No school, no friends. Said the boy was found wandering after a trauma, couldn't speak, no memory of who he was. Vance spun a story about him being the child of a disgraced relative. Elias looked at the boy, who had not moved. He saw the shape of Elena's eyes, the stubborn set of his own jaw hidden beneath the boy's gauntness. He had been so blinded by his grief, he had not allowed himself to see it. Not until the charm. The possibility was a terrifying, fragile seed of hope planted in the barren soil of his heart. A hope so profound it felt like agony. The need to know became a physical force, a fever in his blood. The next morning, leaving the boy in Maria's watchful care, Elias drove to his own house and walked directly to a room that had been closed for 10 years. The door groaned in protest. Dust motes swirled in the single shaft of light piercing the gloom, dancing like tiny ghosts over furniture shrouded in white sheets. He went to a wooden chest in the corner and lifted the lid. The smell of cedar and preserved memories filled the small space. He pulled out a small saddle, its leather dry and cracked. And there, on the cantle, was a small tear in the leather, a tiny hole where something had once been tied, the place where a mother's good luck charm should have been. Meanwhile, Sheriff Brody was in his own dusty office, pulling a long-forgotten file box from the archives. The label, faded with time, read Thorn, Elena and Samuel, accidental drowning his hands, usually so steady, felt clumsy as he sorted through the brittle pages. Police reports, witness statements from neighbors who heard the flash flood, and photographs. He spread the grainy, black-and-white photos across his desk. They showed the swollen, muddy creek, the debris, the grim-faced searchers. One photo showed the spot downstream where they had found Elena. There was no sign of the boy or the pony. But in the background of another shot, almost lost in the tangled brush on the far bank, Brody saw something. A dark shape. It could have been anything. A log, a shadow. But it had the curve of a horse's back. He put a magnifying glass to the image. It was still indistinct, but it was there. And it was on the other side of the floodwaters. The side that led toward the old Vance property. Driven by a hunch that felt more like a certainty, Brody left his office and drove to the county records building. He bypassed the recent digital files and asked the clerk for the physical deed and tax records for Arthur Vance's properties going back 15 years. He also requested birth and wardship records. An hour later, he had it. The key. It wasn't in a photograph, but in a dry, official document. A petition for emergency guardianship, filed by Arthur Vance 9.5 years ago. It named a John Doe, an unidentified boy of approximately 3 years of age, found wandering on his property. The boy was described as nonverbal, suffering from apparent amnesia. A judge, a personal friend of Vance's, had rubber-stamped the request. Months later, that John Doe had been quietly given a new name, Leo Vance. The paperwork was clean, legal, and impenetrable, but the timeline was damning. The boy was found less than a week after the flood that had taken Elias's family, found on land that bordered the far side of the creek. The truth settled on Brody with the cold, heavy weight of a shroud. Vance had not found a stray. He had found Elias Thorne's son, Samuel. He had found the boy, clinging to the pony that had somehow survived the torrent, and instead of returning him, he had stolen him. He had stolen a life, erased a name, and hidden a child in plain sight, counting on Elias's grief to be a permanent blindness. The reason was still a shadow, but Brody suspected it had something to do with Vance's well-known, unrequited obsession with Elena Thorne before she had married Elias. If he could not have her, he would take the one living piece of her that remained. He picked up his phone and called Elias. "You need to come into town," Brody said, his voice stripped of all emotion but a cold, hard certainty. "And you need to prepare yourself. The past isn't just present. It's been living down the road this whole time." The quiet on the ranch was shattered the next afternoon. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival long before the vehicle itself was visible. It was a black, gleaming sport utility vehicle, an unnatural slash of polished modernity against the faded landscape. It rolled to a stop in the yard, its engine a low, arrogant hum before cutting out into a sudden, shocking silence. Arthur Vance emerged from the driver's side. He was dressed in expensive slacks and a blazer, an outfit designed for a boardroom, not a broken-down ranch. He moved with an air of absolute ownership, as if the very ground he walked on belonged to him. Two men, large and impassive in security uniforms, got out of the passenger sides, flanking him like stone pillars. Elias had been waiting on the porch. He did not rise. He simply watched Vance approach, his hand resting on the worn armrest of the wooden chair. The leather charm was in his pocket, a small, hard point of reality against his thigh. The boy, Samuel, had retreated into the house at the first sound of the vehicle, a ghost vanishing back into the shadows. "Thorne," Vance said, his voice smooth and devoid of warmth. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Elias with a gaze that mixed condescension and impatience. "I've come from my ward. And my horse," he held up a thick manila folder. "I have the legal paperwork. Guardianship, proof of ownership. It's all in order. I'm prepared to forget your bizarre little stunt at the auction if you cooperate now." The threat was clear, wrapped in the language of law and reason. He was painting Elias as unstable, an old man clinging to a delusion. He was using his power to define reality. "He's not your ward," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "And that's not your horse." Vance's smile was a razor's edge. "And who are they going to believe, Elias? A respected community benefactor, or a recluse who hasn't spoken to another human being in 10 years? You're in no position to care for a child, especially not one as troubled as Leo." Just then, Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled in behind Vance's vehicle, blocking it in. Maria's truck followed a moment later. They got out and walked to stand at the base of the porch, flanking Elias from below. A small, defiant circle was forming. Brody didn't look at Vance. He looked at Elias. "We have it all, Elias," he said, his voice steady. "The files, the records, the truth." Vance's composure finally cracked. A flicker of something ugly, fear, maybe, or pure rage, crossed his face. "This is absurd," he spat. "This is a private matter. Brody, you have no jurisdiction here." He gestured to his men. "We're taking the boy." The two security men started toward the porch. Elias rose slowly to his feet. He was just a man in worn clothes, but he stood as solid as an old oak, his grief now forged into something hard and unyielding. The confrontation had arrived. The past was no longer a whisper. It was a man in a clean suit trying to break down his door. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, had begun to curdle. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, bruised and heavy. A low, restless wind kicked up, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. It whipped dust into small cyclones that danced across the yard, mirroring the storm brewing between the men. Vance's men took another step toward the porch. "I have a court order," Vance said, his voice rising, straining against the wind. "You are obstructing a legal process." Suddenly, the door to the house creaked open. The boy, Samuel, stepped out. He did not look at Vance. He walked directly to Elias's side and slipped his small hand into the rancher's rough one. It was a silent, absolute choice. At the same moment, a sound tore from the corral. A furious, protective scream. The stallion, Shadow, reared up, its powerful legs striking the air. With a sound of splintering wood, it slammed its body against the old timber gate, once, then twice. The latch broke. The gate swung open. The horse galloped into the yard, a force of black, untamed nature. It did not charge wildly. Its movements were deliberate, intelligent. It moved to stand directly between Vance and his men and the porch where Elias and the boy stood. Its head was low, its ears pinned back, a deep, rumbling growl originating deep in its chest. It had placed its body between the threat and the family it had chosen. Vance's men froze, their professional composure evaporating in the face of a ton of furious animal. Vance himself took a shocked step backward. "Control your animal, Thorn," he shrieked. But Elias was not looking at the horse. He was looking at the boy. He pulled the leather charm from his pocket and held it out on his open palm. Vance's face went white. He recognized it. It was the final, irrefutable piece of a story he had tried to bury for a decade. "Leo, come here," Vance commanded, his voice a desperate, fraying rope. "Now." The boy flinched at the name, but did not move. He looked from the charm in Elias's hand to Vance's terrified, furious face. A decade of forced silence, of confusion and fear, seemed to be fighting for release behind his eyes. He took a shallow, shuddering breath. He pointed a trembling finger, not at the charm, but at Elias. Then he spoke. His voice was a dry, rasping whisper, cracked from years of disuse. A single word, fragile and yet strong enough to shatter the world. "Papa." The word hung in the air, more powerful than the rising wind, more final than the clap of thunder that finally broke overhead. Vance's entire facade crumbled into dust. The lie was dead. His security men exchanged uncertain glances, their allegiance to their employer dissolving in the face of this raw, undeniable truth. Sheriff Brody stepped forward, his hand no longer near his weapon but holding a pair of handcuffs. The charade was over. The storm broke. Rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, instantly turning the dust to dark, slick mud. It was a cleansing, washing away the heat and the tension, washing away the years. Arthur Vance did not resist as Sheriff Brody put the cuffs on him. His power, built on a foundation of lies and control, had evaporated with a single word from a child. He was just a man now, a pathetic, sodden figure whose polished shoes were sinking into the mud. He was led away in silence, his defeat quiet and absolute. On the porch, Elias slowly knelt, the rain plastering his graying hair to his forehead. He looked at his son, Samuel. The name felt foreign and yet perfectly right on his tongue, though he did not say it aloud. He looked into the boy's eyes and saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own lost hope, now miraculously restored. The great weight he had carried for 10 years, the crushing burden of grief and guilt, finally began to shift. It was a physical sensation, an easing in his chest, a loosening around his heart. Samuel stepped forward, out of the shelter of the porch roof, and into the downpour. He put a small, tentative hand on his father's shoulder. And Elias Thorne, the silent, broken man who had forgotten how to feel, surrendered. A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime on his cheek, then another. They mixed with the falling rain, a quiet, cathartic release that was a decade overdue. The stallion, Shadow, stood nearby, its head bowed against the storm, a quiet guardian watching over the reunion it had made possible. The long, silent winter of a man's soul was finally over. The quiet aftermath had begun. Weeks turned into a soft, hazy month, and then another. The oppressive heat of late summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The land itself seemed to be breathing again. The sagging fences on the Thorne Ranch were being mended, their lines now straight and true against the rolling hills. Near the porch, a small patch of earth had been turned, and the withered remains of Elena's flower garden were being carefully tended, new life coaxed from the dormant soil by Maria's gentle hands. The silence of the ranch had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of grief, but a comfortable, living quiet filled with the soft sounds of work and healing. Elias had found a purpose that reached beyond mere survival. It was in the simple, steady rhythm of repairing his world, not just for himself, but for the son he was slowly getting to know. Samuel was still quiet. The trauma of his stolen years had left deep marks that would not fade overnight. But the blankness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a watchful curiosity. He followed Elias everywhere, a small, steady shadow, learning the ways of the ranch not through words, but through observation. He would hand his father a tool before it was asked for, or stand at the gate to the pasture, his presence enough to calm the horses. His bond with the stallion, Shadow, remained a thing of quiet awe. The horse was his confidant, his anchor. In the evenings, the boy would sit in the pasture, leaning against the great animal's side, his fingers tangled in its mane, whispering stories only the horse would ever hear. And Elias would watch from the porch, his heart filled with a quiet, painful, and profound gratitude. An unconventional family had taken root in the wounded soil of the ranch. Elias, the wounded stoic learning to be a father again. Samuel, the lost boy finding his voice in the language of horses and quiet trust. And Maria, who came not as a visitor but as a part of the landscape, her strength and compassion a vital thread weaving them all together. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, the three of them sat on the newly repaired porch steps. Samuel pointed to the pasture, where Shadow was nuzzling a new foal that had been rescued from a neglectful owner. Elias had started taking in other lost animals, his ranch slowly, unofficially, becoming a sanctuary. A soft, shared chuckle passed between Elias and Maria, a sound of gentle humor, of shared survival. Elias looked at his son, at the life returning to his face, and then at the land, which was no longer a tomb but a promise. The past was not gone. It was part of him, a map of scars that told the story of where he had been. But it was no longer his prison. The long road of healing stretched out before them, uncertain and new. But for the first time in a decade, it was a road he was not walking alone. The journey was just beginning.